Time for a comic book education on this freezing morning here at our workplace. My name is Stuart,
And this is Jeremy.
and I'm really excited about this show. I'm excited about every show, of course. But
Yeah, we
this one in
get excited
particular-
about all of them.
This one in particular is really excited, or excites me. We're going to be talking about Alan Moore.
Yeah.
And we've talked about him a little bit, but this is the first time in depth we're going to be talking about him. And we're going to have some Grant Morrison in there, too.
Yeah, I would say this episode should be called the Alan Moore Epiphany.
Yes.
Would be what I would call this.
I think maybe to open, why don't you talk about Alan Moore or your history or your thoughts previous to last week? I guess
that would be a good thing. It actually kind of is tied up in the reason why we do the show a little bit. I don't know how many people know this or not, but if you've been listening from the front, the beginning of the series here, you know that Stuart started collecting comic books just several years ago.
Yeah.
I have been collecting since I was about 10 years old. I turned 40 this year, actually a couple days ago. And so been collecting for a long time, been to comic book conventions. I even had a little bit of a time where I tried to make my own comic books when I was about 18 or 19. And just have been an avid collector and fan ever since. And you would ask me a lot of questions, and you didn't know the history of comic books and why certain books or certain stories were important, and why is this artist important? You would just come and ask me questions. We'd eat at Pizza Hut, and you would have this deluge of why is Jack Kirby important, and who is this Alan Moore guy anyway? And
I would actually write them down so I wouldn't forget and then check them off as we go.
And then you said, you know what, we should turn this into a podcast. And I thought, wow, that's a great idea. I can talk about comics for an extended period of time. And it worked out really well.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I've
that's what
enjoyed
it
it.
is. I'm not an expert in comics, but I'm the expert in your world. That's
Absolutely.
kinda how we started it. So
Absolutely.
So one of the things that you brought up was, what's the deal with these two major books that everybody says influenced comics forever? Dark Knight Returns and The Watchmen.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, the Watchmen movie was just coming out, maybe?
It may have been.
Or might have just have come out.
Right.
So this has been about a 5-year saga of you collecting comics. So it was already out. Watchmen had already come out. Obviously, you were a huge Batman fan even before you started getting into comics.
In the womb. That's how long.
What book did I suggest to you to read first?
You suggested Scott Snyder.
Scott Snyder's.
Greg Capullo, Batman.
But was Detective Comics at that time? No.
The New 52 had just kind of started, and you said I should follow writers.
Yeah.
And you said Scott Snyder was a great up-and-coming guy, so that was the first dive into comics for me.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think that Scott Snyder's one of the inheritors of the kind of the Batman mythos. He's like the main lead guy now, in my opinion, and for a very long time, Grant Morrison was the Batman writer, and even before then, we've got Alan Moore's Killing Joke sitting here on the table. And then, of course, Frank Miller did Dark Knight Returns. And so Batman's always been, in the midst of pushing the envelope in comics for sure. And
I mean, he's had some of the best writers out there. I mean,
he really
Neil
has.
Adams was there. I mean, it's just because he's the best character, in my opinion. So
he might very well be the best superhero to write about.
It's
He's
true.
He's pretty great. I mean, he's fractured and interesting and multi-layered, and the costume, the silhouette's cool. I mean, all the great. Gosh darn it,
Yes.
this could become a Batman podcast
which
very quickly.
you've already done.
We've already done, and we'll do more of in the future for sure. So you asked me questions, and I would talk about how I really didn't care for Frank Miller very much. I didn't like Dark Knight Returns. And the reason that it's not that I don't appreciate the style and the form of it, and I do think there's good writing in it. I don't care for the message and kind of what I think it did to comic books. And I considered it the same kind of level Watchmen. However, in that case, I really loved the story in Watchmen and the characters in Watchmen. I just thought that the effect they had in comics was purposeful. And I think it kind of was on Frank Miller's part, and I think it necessarily wasn't, or a different purpose was meant through Watchmen. And I really had not read Watchmen in a very long time. I had not watched the movie for years, just kind of out of I don't know, like this moral stance I was taking that I wasn't going to dive in there to something that I thought had damaged comics. And so interestingly enough, I watched the movie, been 2 or 3 years ago. I really like the movie. I love the story of Watchmen. I think it's extremely interesting. I love all of it. I know you didn't necessarily care for the movie very much. You said it wasn't for you.
Yeah, it's fine for me.
Not sure if it's the
I think it was the tone. It was just
it's pretty dark.
I hadn't seen a superhero movie like that. So
well, there never has been and probably never will be any kind of superhero story or a movie like that. And actually, what's interesting about the movie is it is darker in color and feel than the comic book. In the comic book, they actually chose to use the secondary palette when it comes to printing comics. And nowadays, we have digital printing, and so you can use any color you want and any type of shading and Photoshop and using these great papers and digital presses and come up with amazing, beautiful works of art. But back in the day, comic books were limited to running on 4-color presses with, just 4 colors of ink: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And they would run. And if you wanted your colors to look really good, you used very strong combinations of those 4 colors. So that's why Superman works so well, because he is a bright blue, a bright yellow, and a bright red.
I never thought about that.
That's why he's the man. That's why the X-Men were bright blue and yellow, and that's why the Hulk changed from gray to green, because the gray didn't print very well. Batman was blue and black. I mean, you could really kind of get what you need there, and with the bright yellow chest plate. So all of the classic colors and styles of the superheroes evolved from the way the printing press worked, and obviously patriotic themes, things like that created it. Well, with the Watchmen, they decided to use a secondary palette, which meant using greens and purples and browns. And it's not a dark comic. If you open it up, you get bright bits of pink, and you get these bright bits of yellow, and then you get kind of these darker purple colors, and it's a very colorful comic book. It's just different than the regular ones were. They did that on purpose because Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were hoping to explore why the heck people would ever put on a mask. What would have to happen to you to make you dress up and fight crime? And then what would happen to you after you did that? And what would happen if there was a world where somebody had the powers of a god? And that's a very different type of story and statement than what Frank Miller was trying to say with Dark Knight Returns, which is a lot more political in nature and had a lot more to do with the Cold War. And there's elements of that in The Watchmen, but it's not the predominating message of it. And anyway, I had thought about that a little bit, but I hadn't really realized that I was removing myself from Alan Moore's writing entirely based on what I had heard other people say about him and about why he wrote The Watchmen, and then really kind of blaming him for the effect that it had. And I guess you could really say that he is a little bit to blame for the effect it had, but it's actually the misinterpretation of the point of Watchmen that caused a lot of the issues.
Alan Moore, just to say, I mean, what is he? I mean, he's a
British,
yeah, and he's into
all kinds of crazy stuff.
He looks kind of scary, but
he looks very scary. He looks like a Eastern European prophet of doom is what he looks like. He's got this huge beard. He's very thin, especially in older pictures. His face is very angular. He's got dark sunken eyes. He says very, inflammatory things. He hates the business side of comics. He despises certain people, and he's pretty vocal about these things. But anyway, so a couple things have happened here, and that's why we're having this podcast. That's why we're talking about all this. I bought on Audible Grant Morrison's book called Super Gods. It is about 16 to 17 hours worth of audio listening. It's a pretty big book. And I, buy different types of books on Audible and have tried to buy like superhero novelizations and things like that. And there's really not a lot of great books that accomplish telling the story of superheroes in comics in novel form, because they're predominantly a visual medium, and we want to see them in comic book format, and that's really the best way to do it. But reading a history of comic books / manifesto from one of the most interesting guys in comics, Grant Morrison, sounded like a really good idea, and so that's what I did. And actually, kind of over the holidays, finished that up, and really ended up, taking like extra drives to make sure that I could listen to, another hour, or getting up early and checking it out, or sitting on the roof at lunch and listening the whole time. And man, I cannot recommend this book enough. And you want to talk about a weird guy that does weird stuff? Grant kind of slides into that area. He has a little bit, or had a little bit, of the Jim Morrison theory of creativity, where you kind of need to evoke spirits, and you need to imbibe in strange hallucinogens. And he definitely was a part of the punk scene and in England, and involved in kind of the resurgence of English comics in the early 90s that created Vertigo. And he did a comic book called The Invisibles. He would write comic books about things that were happening in his life and putting himself as the character and having things happen to him. He would try to break the fourth wall and have the comic book be an extension of what you were doing in reality, and what was happening in the comic book was reality as well. And he just has a lot of crazy ideas, and he
still does.
And he unravels his reasoning behind why he wrote certain things, and his story of getting into comics, and along with the history of comic books. And so he starts with the birth of Superman, and he goes into Batman, and he talks for chapters about Batman and why the mythology works, and how, for example, how the guys that created the comics code were offended by the homosexual undertones in Batman. And you had Alfred and Bruce and Dick in the Batcave, and there was all this, what they considered homosexual tension. They didn't want boys reading that stuff, so they couldn't have them talk about crime. And so the next thing you know, Batman's going off into space and solving goofy adventures, and that ended up pushing the writers to do things very differently with all the characters. So it was almost like the constraints of the comic book code created the Silver Age as it came out of the Golden Age. And then changes about how characters were treated, and Neil Adams and what he brought to the table, and Stan Lee and what he brought to the table. Is a super interesting first half of the book. It really surrounds the history of comic books and superheroes. And then he enters the scene, right? Grant enters the scene, and it really shifts into his journey and how he was, after Invisibles did well, and he wrote a book called Batman Arkham Asylum, which is his famous opus of Batman. You like that one a lot?
Yeah, very weird.
It's weird, but it's a great book.
Yes, it is.
And when he wrote that, everybody, he went sky high. And in the early 90s, comic books were so big. It wasn't the competition of video games and movies like you have now. And comic book writers were making really, really good money. And they would get royalty checks that would just keep coming in, and they'd write a big book and it'd be huge. And they'd be, he was asked to write a couple issues of Spawn, and they were almost as big as the Arkham Asylum books. And anyway, it's very interesting to hear him talk through all of that. Well, in the midst of it, he starts talking about the revolution that happened at DC in the mid-'80s, where Dark Knight Returns came out and the Watchmen came out, and how much that affected him as he was beginning to write and draw comics and what he wanted to do in England. And he was angry at Alan Moore as a young man, Grant Morrison was, because he saw Alan Moore trying to sully or discredit his heroes, which was the exact same thought philosophy I had as I was, listening to other people talk about what happened. And as I began to read, he talked about what Alan Moore said he was doing and what the point was of the Watchmen, which was to, again, stretch the superhero paradigm as far as you can, figure out why people would really do it, and have a realistic approach as to what does it take to make a person put on a mask. And that brought Alan to a very dark place, and Alan did it in the confines of a super defined and detailed format. So it's even like if you open up the Watchmen, it is done on a 9-panel grid. Okay, so you may have one panel that spans 3 columns, but nobody's breaking the planes of any of these frames, and most of the pages are set up in these 9-panel grids like this, and you get these wonderful pages that alternate colors. So you kind of have this warm yellow and then a purple and then a warm yellow and then a purple, and it creates these grids. And so there was this defined format that Grant Morrison thought was too constricting to do this. It was like Alan Moore had built this perfect watch, which is another analogy inside the watch, but if you read it, everything is based on a watch. In fact, the blood splatter itself is a second hand that is 5 minutes till midnight, and that happens throughout the entire book. There are aspects where the clock is ticking, the doomsday clock is ticking, and it's getting towards midnight. So there's that level of detail, like your little aha moment there. That happens about 100 times, and we probably missed 100 more of them that are in it. So it's this really rich, detailed mechanism that you can open up and look at. But it can't grow any bigger than it is. It is a microcosm of what Alan wanted to accomplish, which is explore a superhero. Grant wanted to say, okay, what happens what real psychology comes into play to become a superhero, and what good can you do? So as crazy as Grant Morrison is, he's still kind of ruled by the themes of love and redemption and sacrifice, and that's why All-Star Superman is his answer to this. It's kind of like the Silver Age embracing of what superheroes could be, not what they would be, which is what Alan did. So hearing him talk about all of this, I'm like, you know what? I need to give Watchmen a second chance, especially when I heard how Rorschach becomes the emerging favorite character out of Watchmen. Everybody loves Rorschach. He's the one that you do the sketches of. Nobody's doing the sketches of, overweight Owlman. It's always Rorschach with a meat cleaver coming down, in between a forehead of a rabid dog. Anyway, that's a image you'll never get out of your head. But Alan Moore did not like the fact that Rorschach he had actually written Rorschach as a dogmatic, uncompromising fascist that is basically taking the law in his own hands and has a lot of deep-rooted issues in his life. And all of a sudden, after the Watchmen, Rorschach is celebrated. He becomes the Wolverine of that era, and the combination of the success of Wolverine, the success of Rorschach, and the success of Watchmen in general, and then combine that with Batman and the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns with all the pouches and gear and gadgets and intensity to fight against the man and authority and capitalism and all these kind of things, basically builds the superheroes that showed up in the late 80s and early 90s that destroyed the comic book industry.
Did this have effect on the Marvel side at all?
Absolutely.
Or was it just DC?
Oh no, okay. Absolutely. Those two books, Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, had effect on all of the books. Everything took a dark turn. All of a sudden, Spider-Man was no longer, swinging through the air and being happy. Spider-Man needed a black suit that was feeding off of his subconscious and causing all kinds of problems. You see what I'm saying? So everything, even the brighter, more mainstream comics, all had to take a dark turn. The X-Men, that's when Charles Xavier started kind of being the almost vilified in the X-Men books. I mean, there's a little bit of that in Claremont Burns' run, but it gets even worse at that point. There's a lot of examples of just how the Watchmen changed both, and Dark Knight Returns changed both companies. A lot of it doesn't manifest until the generation that was young men reading this book, idealizing the Watchmen, idealizing Dark Knight Returns, get their hands on the properties. And that was when Jim Lee, Jim Valentino, Rob Liefeld, Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane, all of those artists and writers that had been working at Marvel, that wanted to push the envelope, that wanted darker, that wanted more flashy stories, they said, this is what we want to tell, and Marvel and DC aren't letting us, and we're not getting paid enough for creating all these great characters. Let's do our own thing, and Image Comics was born out of that. And Image Comics inflated the prices, and they would have 17 versions of issue number 1 with gold foil, and collectors and speculators are like, oh, this has to be great. And so everybody kind of is led to the slaughter by buying too many comics. And next thing you know, comic book stores across the country, in some estimates, like 80% of comic book stores closed in the 90s. That's horrible. And it was the fault of these speculators, people buying too many books, and then people not buying them because they weren't really that good. They didn't come out on time, and there were a couple things that emerged. I mean, Spawn went on for several hundred issues, I believe, at least over 100. And Jim Lee is a very good businessman, almost as good of a businessman as he is a draftsman, and so he emerged with a library and catalog of heroes called Wildstorm that he sold to DC. He's now part of DC. Wildcats and Stormwatch and Cyberforce. I mean, just crazy stuff. Then Top Cow came out of it. And
what?
Top Cow.
Top Cow.
Yeah, Mark Silvestri and his group, and lots of great Jay Campbell. I think Jay Campbell. Scott Campbell. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm get Gen 13. There's all kinds of good things that happened. Also, you have Dark Horse trying to get into the mix, and they empowered Frank Miller and Mike Mignola that created Hellboy, and John Byrne that created the Next Men, and so they had some individual properties there. Sin City came out of that imprint that Dark Horse did, and all of it was this exploration of the darker side of superheroes. I think it allowed Batman, the 89 Batman movie, to be created. And Alan's whole point was not to make cool, dark heroes that inspire kids to read, and deify heroes like Deadpool, but that's what happened. And so now, having enough perspective after going through all of the 90s, being able to survive it, continue to really see the renaissance of comics come back in the mid 2000s, and even still to today. We're getting amazing work that's coming out from a lot of different types of artists and writers. And even though comic book sales are not what they used to be, the movies have come into play, and comic books are really the incubators for these cinematic stories that happen. And so I decided that I would dive in a bit to Alan Moore, read a little bit more about him personally. I've watched some YouTube videos of the guy, and I actually got a great book, which is Alan Moore's Guide to Writing Comics. And he wrote it in the 90s and actually talked about some of this stuff. And he ends that book by talking about how much you have to be aware as a writer, and you can't write about things that you don't know or understand. So if you're going to write a story about a haunted killer and a murderer and the psychology of what it took to go there, you can't just base it on other comic books you've read. And I think that was a great line, because that's what happened to all the writers in the 90s. They didn't base their writing and their stories on experiences that they had and things that they researched. They based it on other comic books, and everything became derivative. And there's one thing you can say about Grant Morrison: he's not derivative.
No.
He is completely unique.
Yes.
And I love. I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I'm going to say I love Multiversity. I know it's, again, not one of your favorites, but you do like Grant Morrison.
I do.
Multiversity is an amazing set of comic books that explores the different universes inside the DC universe, and how ours is connected to it, and how comics that we read, if the heroes are talking to us, does it affect the way we perceive the story? Breaking the fourth wall, just really cool stuff.
Well, he did Justice League. JLA was a big run that he did.
He had a huge run on JLA, and it was his. I want to write the Justice League of America, and I want to give them the honor that they're due. So it wasn't a dissect them and pick them apart. It was, how would a team work with that many powerful heroes on it? What does it take to keep them together? What are the villains that they need to fight? How can you continue to challenge them? And that's why those stories are so interesting, is because you've got villains that are challenging Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, the core group. He did do this great book called JLA Earth 2, which involves Ultraman and involves the crime syndicate that's on Earth 2, and Batman, Wonder Woman. So it's drawn by Frank Quitely, which I know you're not a big fan of his either. I love his stuff. This is a great book.
And he's got an Owlman in there.
Yeah, Owlman's in here. Yeah. It's really cool. And Grant does have some crazy stuff. I mean, he believes in the occult, and he brings those kind of dream episodes that he's had directly into comics, and he wants to twist up stories at the end. It's almost like M. Night Shyamalan a little bit when it comes to the comic book world. Seven Soldiers of Victory that I got out right here is a crazy set of 7 heroes told in 7 4-issue limited series, and it's one bad guy, 7 different heroes that never meet, and they have to defeat the bad guy together in a way that the stories intertwine to make it happen at the end. Wow, and it is everything from Guardian, who is a very, very much a traditional DC hero, to Justin, who is the Shining Knight, who is a knight of Camelot, and he gets thrown into our current time, and he has flashbacks to the Witch Boy, who is a half elf demon that lived in a Puritan world inside the earth, and how he gets out, and Zatanna is in it, and Frankenstein, who,
of course,
I mean, it's like this just bizarre set of characters, the Seven Soldiers of Victory. And Grant had been working on new X-Men, and he did a lot of stuff with the X-Men around the time the movies came out, gave them the leather jackets, and it kind of was copied by the X-Men movies, and continued to write those stories, and he really got tired of Marvel, and he was ready to leave, and he jumped ship back to DC, and he's been with DC ever since. And he had just worked on Seven Soldiers by himself without any plans of it ever getting published, because he wanted to write something that would pushed him, and X-Men, he was just phoning in the X-Men. And so this pushed him. It's a super detailed, interesting format and stuff. Anyway, I love all that. We have been cruising through this podcast because I've been just talking. But the one thing you wanted me to talk about today was The Killing Joke, which is...
because I wanted you to explain to me how this possibly works into your new philosophy of Alan Moore, because this is incredibly...
it's dark.
It's got some just crazy stuff. Jim Gordon comes to mind.
Yeah, so let me tell you real quickly how this works in. The Killing Joke is a Joker story. It is not a Batman story. And Batman is not really in it a lot. He's pushed around some, and he's trying to figure out what the Joker is doing, and he ends up having a kind of final confrontation, and thank God saves Jim Gordon in the book, spoiler alert. Batman is kind of the voice of reason, but it is reason in the face of perceived insanity. However, this is my thought process when reading this book, which I just finished yesterday and never read before. And you were giving me a hard time because it's one of Alan Moore's big ones and I had never read it. So in my new kind of appreciation for him, it made sense for me to do that in preparation for the podcast here. I feel like this has a hint of what was done in the Dark Knight movie by Christopher Nolan, in a sense that you see the Joker saying that he's insane. You watch the Joker doing crazy stuff, but everything the Joker does is extremely calculated. He is a criminal mastermind. He's not insane. And the whole point is the Joker's persona is the joke, because this opens up the history of what happened to create the Joker. And so I enjoyed learning about the Joker's history, or a possible history, like even if he was making it up or thinking about it or whatever. It's certainly the one that jives with most of DC Comics history, and certainly what Scott Snyder's pulling from in his current run. But that the explanation that it gives, it's awesome to just watch the Joker work. He has this calculated master evil plan, and I don't mind a writer writing a bad guy who had something happen to him but is evil and needs to be stopped.
I think one of the taglines is "one bad day." So I was saying, anybody could, I guess, have these kind of ideas if one thing goes wrong.
Could you be pushed to the point of becoming the Joker? And to me, the Joker doesn't lose his mind after he takes off the red hood and sees the stuff on his face. He's awakened to the joke of what's happened to him. And the only way to react is to continue to play that role, and Batman becomes his focal point. And we see that in Dark Knight. We see it in the Scott Snyder's run. And we see it in here. And his whole goal is to punish the Batman and make him see the joke. He wants Batman to join him in laughing at themselves. And Batman is so unwilling to find any humor in anything. And at the very end of this book, Batman laughs at the Joker's joke, which means that did the Joker get to Batman? And there's the controversy at the end of this book is that did Batman kill the Joker. What did you think when you first read it?
I didn't think so.
Really?
No, I guess I did. And then I listened to a podcast with Grant Morrison saying, yeah, that definitely he killed the Joker in that one.
That's totally what I would have. That's totally the way I interpreted it. At the end of this, Brian Boland writes afterword, and he talks about this controversy, and make sure I get back to it by the end of my forward. And then he has a ... and actually doesn't tell you whether or not it happened. But he's leading it up to possibly did. I've heard Alan Moore say, or the original script that was written did not leave it ambiguous. Like the cop lights are coming, and there are some flashing lights in the panels there, and supposedly it would stop Batman from killing the Joker. But I think that's kind of the point of the book. And could you do something to Batman to make him crack? And Alan Moore wanted to write that story, and that's an okay thing to explore. It's not doing anything to Batman and Superman the way Dark Knight Returns did. Batman's obviously the hero here. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And then Jim Gordon is a victim.
And Barbara.
Is a victim. But they're just little pawns in Joker's game. I mean, they're not they're calculated positions to move Batman where you got to move him. And so I really, really enjoyed it.
It's crazy.
I know you're a huge fan of that art. I love Brian Boyd.
I love
I'm
him.
much more of a fan of Dave Gibbons' style and some of these other guys, but I like it. It's good. It's hyper detailed, lots of rendering in it.
It's just interesting. We can have this Alan Moore and that Alan Moore, and then he can write, whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow.
Right. He write Tom
whoa.
Strong, which
Yeah.
is just insanely good.
Yeah.
So yeah, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, these are two writers that I just hope that if you dive into just traditional comics and you're reading, modern stuff right now, like you're picking up The Flash every week or you're reading The Hulk every week, and you're not a fan of diving into back issues, I would just really encourage you to go back and pick up some of these key things to understand why comics are the way they are. Find out why these writers write what they do, and how comic books can shift from the external to the internal. We can look at the outside and the heroes and what they're doing, and then we go internal and we see the psychology of them, and there's different paths, and we have like a wave pattern almost that happens in comics where we go super external with Jonathan Hickman style stuff to then really internal with what Grant's doing. It's crazy to watch the flow. Scott Snyder's an internal guy. He's all about what makes Batman tick, what makes the Joker tick, why are they doing what they're doing, and I'm ready for him to write some other characters. I know you would love just to be Batman, but yes. I want Scott to share the love. I want to see what he's going to do with some of these other heroes.
A thing with Jim Lee and Superman, and it was.
You did not like it. I'm gonna have to read this because I may enjoy. Is it Superman Unchained?
Yeah.
Unchained. I'll have to check that out.
I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to say how big this show is, because literally when Jeremy came into the office and said that he
had the Alan Moore epiphany,
I was shocked. And we talked for about 10 minutes. Then he had to go. I literally followed him back 5 minutes later and came back in the office and was like, "Are you being serious?" Like, it was just insane. So anyway,
to close. I mean, I'm not condoning all of Alan Moore and Grant Morrison's personal life choices.
Yeah.
I am saying that their writing is valid. It needs to be explored, and it's not something to be afraid of. Interpreting dark characters that are flawed and putting them on a pedestal and start revering them is the issue that I'm wanting to make sure I stay away from. So read The Watchmen. It's great.
I guess.
You're going to have to
popular.
Get in there.
All right, for Comic Book Education, my name is Stuart.
And this is Jeremy.
Class dismissed.